the globe. It's exciting to have the customer success industry and this discipline continue to grow. Is one of the fastest growing roles in the software as a service space. We want to welcome you to this customer success webinar series brought to you by ClientSuccess, being broadcast from beautiful Utah. I am Burke Alder, VP of Marketing and a Customer Success Strategist here at ClientSuccess. ClientSuccess is a customer success management platform that helps leaders and CSMs retain and grow their customer base. We do this by helping you build communication and collaboration across the customer lifecycle. Our webinar today will cover 3 fresh topics on how to nail onboarding and adoption. And I would say this is one of those topics that is so in demand and people are really trying to figure out. So it's going to be awesome to introduce today's panelists, and they're all going to have 3 great presentations. We will hear from Erica Newell, from Manager of Client Development at Marketware. We'll hear from McKayl Bergman, Head of Customer Success, the Lucid Press side of their business from Lucid Software, and Sam Feil, Customer Success Professional at ClientSuccess. We will be recording this webinar, and this will be sent to your inbox. At the bottom of the webinar, you will see a nice Q&A feature where you can just add the question as we collaborate and go through this. It's designed to be collaborative. We will do our best to answer some of these questions during the presentation, and we will leave some time at the end for a Q&A. So it's my pleasure to welcome Erica, McKayl, Sam, and we're excited to hear from you. We will get started with Sam on the topic of 3 essential pre-onboarding principles that sets you up perfectly to nail onboarding. Sam, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Burke. So as he mentioned, my name is Sam Feil, and I am a Customer Success Manager here at ClientSuccess. It is my pleasure to share with you today 3 essential pre-onboarding principles. And for the sake of this presentation, I am going to define pre-onboarding as the time prior to bringing clients on board or beginning their implementation. I believe that this period serves as an excellent opportunity to set and build relationship momentum, as well as set both you and your clients up for greater long-term success. So these 3 principles are going to be sequential in the fact that I will begin with develop, document, and strengthen customer lifecycle plans. We will then review ensuring customer onboarding readiness, and then we'll conclude with identifying key individuals, influencers, and contacts. So principle 1, this idea of developing, documenting, and strengthening customer lifecycle plans. There are 6 steps that in the time that I've been a CSM for ClientSuccess that I've been able to learn and observe as I have engaged with other customer success professionals on a daily basis. There is a key training that we actually hold with clients who come on board with ClientSuccess that focuses around lifecycle management, the end result being able to configure what you'll see a little bit of success cycles or templated customer plans or playbooks. With nearly 3 years of this experience, having onboarded over 100 customers, it's been interesting to learn these 6 steps to help them become successful, as well as how to avoid some of the risks that might come up with managing plans or playbooks. So it does ultimately come down to whether or not you develop, document, or strengthen these plans. So these 6 steps begin with 1, dedicating time. Though it may seem like you can wing it and find short-term success with your whatever sort of playbook you might be focusing on, maybe you are setting a goal as a team to redo your onboarding process or adoption or renewal, whatever it might be. People feel like the short-term success they find is enough. But long-term, stepping back for a moment to truly understand your customer lifecycle objectives would be better for both you and your clients in the long term. I think it's easy for a lot of teams to find themselves using the excuse that they don't have time or bandwidth to discover what their customer objectives should be. So I would recommend making, as you dedicate time to develop this idea of lifecycle plans, to make objectives a priority. Don't simply seek to take your clients through an implementation checklist, but dedicate the time, even if just an hour-long sprints, to document your process. They even recommend setting aside an afternoon or two in order to take a deeper dive. That's something that we have done here at ClientSuccess, specifically over the past 6 to 8 months around our onboarding experience. That has been our objective at this moment in time. So we have been going through ways that we can iterate on our process, which you will see as being step number 6 here at the very end. But step number 1, dedicating time. So some questions to ask yourself during this time would be, what are 2 to 3 changes that you can try to implement in the next 30 days? Which brings us to step number 2. Once you've dedicated this time and you have begun to involve whatever leaders you need, if it's just yourself, your director, your head, or VP of customer success, now it comes to whiteboarding or outlining this process of yours. I think that in order to have well-documented lifecycle plans, there's a creative process behind it, beginning with this idea of outlining what you are currently doing. The success that will come from visualizing your thoughts or whiteboarding through whiteboarding or outlining will facilitate the next steps you need to help you realize what your pain points are, what friction points may be, and areas of improvement could be as well. So the slide that you see now is actually a whiteboarding activity that we did here at ClientSuccess. About 6 months ago, we've recently done another whiteboarding activity for our onboarding, but what you can see here is we have our onboarding broken out into different stages of that lifecycle plan, from sales all the way to onboarding and configuration sessions. And what this was able to do, this whiteboarding activity, was help us in the 3rd step, identify what we have control over. So going back to this screenshot of the whiteboard, because you'll be putting this whiteboarding or outline exercise in a visual representation, the areas you have control will become more apparent. It's also easier to create a list of actionable items, and I would recommend considering introducing 2 to 3 changes at a time and always look to iterate. So to highlight some of these real quick, one of the arrows you see here in sales focuses around an intro email being sent within 24 hours and a welcome email. One of the overarching objectives we had during our onboarding was to do a better job at setting expectations. So with the intro email, we worked in 24 hours response to that welcome email. That's an expectation that we are now setting that was previously not being set. And we've also worked in a strategy to gather success criteria, which I have screenshots later on in the presentation as part of step number 4. But going back, once you've identified these points, it's quite easy to say, what can you change? So it's whether things that need to be documented, things that need to be rearranged, or things that just need to be enhanced. One of the rearranging things that we did as part of this onboarding experience was some of the order of the calls that we were giving. So here in the box to the right, you see call number 2, renewal management. We moved that up to actually be right after data import and integration. So step number 3, identifying pay points, friction points, and areas of improvements that you have control over. So after you've been able to identify those steps, it's now time to create well-documented plans. You'll want to get your ideas written down in a more permanent form. And as we went through this exercise at ClientSuccess, we took our onboarding process and through internal documents, created training calls, or training documents for each of the calls. So that's this next screen that you're seeing. Again, I think a thing that I like to stress with the clients who we bring on board is, depending on your bandwidth and resources, is that it's okay to be scrappy if you have to, or just use the resources that are available to you. In this case, for documenting our processes, we look to Google Drive. We happen to be on the G Suite, and Google Drive is available as part of that the tools that we are using there. So over on the left, you have some training documentation, so that if we were to, let's say, hire a new CSM, here at ClientSuccess, we very clearly have the objectives of each call documented out, along with some of the questions that we like to ask. And over on the right, we worked on documenting sort of the action items or follow-up emails that we are communicating with to our customers in order to standardize what we are doing. So once we had created those documented plans, it was time to implement this. All the work that we've done, and again, this is sort of the Cliff Notes version of that, so I'd be happy to connect with anyone who had additional questions about these steps. Step 5, implementing. So you've done the work of understanding what changes you need to make, you've documented those, and now you're ready to introduce that in some sort of way. For us at ClientSuccess, we have success cycles, which is a specific feature in our platform that allows you to create these templated playbooks. The screenshot that you are seeing is just a piece of the onboarding success cycle that we have. I'm going to refer back to that the whiteboard activity where we wanted to set a better expectation of sales being introduced to the CSM 24 hours and that idea. So the very first activity that you see here is do 1 day into cycle. So as we've implemented this, I can be reminded to reply to that sales intro email. We've even included that email template for quick access if we wanted to send that to the customer. So some of the questions to ask yourself at this point as you are going from the whiteboard to the implementation is, does your company have well-documented customer lifecycle plans? What are 2 to 3 pain points in your customer lifecycle process do you have control? If not, who does, and how can you mitigate? Because all of this work that you put into the actual implementation of the lifecycle plans will provide some sort of benefit to you in form of understanding where the customer is and what is coming up next. But it's not going to have much meaning or be on a strong foundation unless you follow steps 1 through 4 prior to implementing. Which brings us to step number 6 in this first principle, and then we'll quickly go through principles 2 and 3, is iterate. Steps 1 through 5 are not something that you'll go through once. Remember that your product, company, and customers are constantly changing. So if you do the same thing that you've always done, you're likely going to achieve the same results you always have. So having a successful customer lifecycle is great, but when was the last time your company evaluated its process, for example, onboarding? There is always an opportunity to learn and optimize. So if you're struggling to identify ways to iterate on your current process, high level, some things to consider: have you segmented out your customers based off of revenue tier or account type, industry, features and functionalities, or system requirements and integrations? So again, what are 2 to 3 enhancements you can try to implement in the next 30 days? When was the last time your company evaluated their customer lifecycle plans? Which brings us to principle number 2.
Hey, Sam, before you jump into this one, what's been a positive result of implementing those 6 steps for you as a professional in customer success?
Great question. So I would say one of the benefits of following these 6 steps is it just allows me to see and identify those changes as my company, product, and customers are changing, how we can better serve them. So right now, an interesting thing that we are working on here at ClientSuccess is how to better serve a lower touch customer. So whereas previously the onboarding experience has been the same for all of our customers, we're now getting to that point in our customers or in our company maturity where we can start to focus on how do we best serve lower touch customers. And this 6-step process helps me identify what changes we can make to best serve them.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So principle number 2, a little bit less detail to it than the first principle, but one thing that I find critically important as you are pre-onboarding a customer is to ensure their onboarding readiness. So SaaS as a business, we thrive on collecting data, whether it's marketing, sales, or customer success. We love to collect data on our customers. So an important thing to remember as I go to this next slide, there are 5 best practices that I'm just going to run through. The first thing is that different touch points have different purposes in collecting data. For example, pre-sales is tasked with acquiring and closing new deals, whereas post-sales can and should influence what information is critical to collect. So in pre-sales, some of the things that you might be familiar with, and I don't have a slide for this, this is the only slide for the best practices, but to talk you through some of the things that you might be collecting on the pre-sales side: system requirements, integrations, limitations, relationship risks or limitations, contacts who were involved during the sales process, goals that the customer has, and extent of involvement pre-sales. However, as you jump into the customer success side of things, you might need to confirm who an actual implementation owner might be, what other stakeholders might be involved, etc. So as you keep in mind that different touch points do have different purposes in collecting data, you should also remember, as you see in number 2 here, that collecting that critical information as early as possible before it's too late should be a priority of yours. For example, if certain integrations are critical or system requirements are critical to the health of a customer as you are onboarding them, and your sales team is not or could do a better job at collecting more specific information about the system requirements or limitations, collect it as soon as you can. If sales isn't collecting it, when you step in, collect it as soon as you can. Which is number 3, gathering the additional relevant information I have here in parentheses success criteria can also serve as an excellent opportunity to close the gap on some of the information that you may not have. So I think the next slide is actually a screenshot of an onboarding success criteria form that we use for our customers. You see here we have very specifically who the implementation owner is, any other stakeholders, executive members who the CS reports to. Some of the other things that I like to capture, probably my favorite question, are timelines and or constraints as they come on board with client success. So if you know that your onboarding takes 5 weeks, but a customer wants to get implemented in 2 weeks, that allows you, as you kick off the relationship, to put a stake in the ground for the custom work that might need to be done, or even assess the client's current environment and capabilities, where if they are lacking a certain administrator on their end, you can help them be prepared for what that onboarding will look like. So then building relationship momentum will be a natural result of collecting this information. You will build yourself up as a trusted advisor and impact really this entire momentum of onboarding and post-onboarding throughout the relationship, as well as set those expectations. So before moving on to principle 3, there are 2 questions here that I would ask. How do you assess a current client's environment or capabilities? And is there information that you should be gathering earlier in the relationship? So the
Great.
final.
Hey, Sam, I have, let me ask you one few question before you kind of go there. What advice would you give for someone engaging with legacy customers who maybe have been a customer for several years, but haven't gone through a formal onboarding process because there really maybe wasn't one in place? What's your advice?
That's a very good question. I think that the idea of identifying which information you might be lacking for those customers, and then coming up with a game plan, whether it's a quarterly business review or check-in where you collect that information. Don't be afraid to ask what you don't know, because you're going to be asking these questions for the benefit of your customers.
Great. And maybe one final question. How would you address customer side delays in projects? That never happens, right? Implementation, no delays. What's how do you address that?
Again, I think that expectation management of being forward with the client and letting them know that they might be behind. If you don't know the reason why, of course, so trying to find out why it might be behind, and if there's maybe a half step that you can take in order to help them to achieve a goal. If someone's struggling with some sort of integration that they might be trying to connect because of development resources on their end, try to look for other ways to bring value to the onboarding experience so that it doesn't become more delayed.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay. Then my last principle here, this one requires consistent effort throughout the entire customer relationship. And much like the other principles that I've reviewed, is not a one-time activity. But I do think as you kick off a relationship, it's a great opportunity to identify key individuals, influencers, and contacts. So ensuring customer onboarding readiness, which was the previous principle, includes understanding who your implementation owner, key stakeholders, and relationship influencers are. As previously discussed in that principle, because of limitations on the pre-sale side, you may have to do this additional work to gather information about their current environment and capabilities. So this opportunity in this context to align on contact-related information would be a good best practice for you to start. So the next slide is actually just a pretty easy graph to understand about your customers. And as you look at this, I'm going to be talking about a principle called high and wide. So Dave Blake, who is our founder and CEO of ClientSuccess, has encouraged CSMs and CS organizations to go high and wide, explaining that the concept references the goal to develop as many relationships as possible, high and wide within your organization, rather than having the entire relationship hinge on one or two lower level contacts that have little to no influence or buying power. Broaden your scope to develop as many relationships as possible throughout the organization. Not only will you strengthen the overall relationship, but you'll also uncover other opportunities to add value to their business that may result in expansion revenue. So I think that at a minimum, it's important to track the relationship implementation owner, who could be the key contact, and executive sponsors, who they report to. So a question to ask yourself, what contacts are you currently tracking? And as you look at these contacts, this graph that you are seeing is a great way to look at the characteristics of those contacts. There are 4: role, influence, pulse, and relationship. So as you look at the people you're involved with, are they involved on the business side, financial side, or technical side of the company? Who are they? Are they a user, a project lead, or executive sponsor? Then influence might be a little bit more of a difficult one to sort of gauge for the client, but essentially this is the influence on the renewal or the relationship. Are they the person who will sign off on the renewal? In that sense, they could have very high influence. Or are they just an end user who happens to be a great advocate of yours, who has little to no influence on the renewal?
Hey, Sam, what's your advice when someone buys the tool and there's another area who's actually going to use it, but they're not part of the onboarding process? You may have already answered that, but
yeah. So I think it depends on what your onboarding looks like. Typically for us, the implementation owner versus the end users, the implementation owner helps us do all the configuring and heavy lifting to prepare ClientSuccess for the users, and then we pull the users in for a user training and sort of like a Q&A office hours type of training for them. So it just depends. That's one strategy that we're using.
thanks. That's great.
So the last two here then, before we review the 3 principles: pulse, do they like you? Do they not like you? Are they an advocate? In the sense, are they promoting externally the relationship? Are they a champion where they are helping other maybe executives within their team come on board with whatever sort of partnership you have going on? Then especially thinking about like maybe weak relationships. If you have an executive sponsor with a weak relationship, that can help you identify ways to maybe re-engage with that executive sponsor. And then what are they interested in? Positive results or what sort of business impact? So those were my 3 essential pre-onboarding principles: develop, document, and strengthen customer lifecycle plans, ensuring customer onboarding readiness, then identifying key individuals, influencers, and contacts. Before we move on to Erica's presentation, if you do have additional questions, since 15 minutes is only 15 minutes, I actually do have some blogs for each of these principles that are up on clientsuccess.com/blog that go a little bit more in depth, or you can feel free to reach out to us through the webinar or to me directly through LinkedIn. So thank you for listening to the 3 essential pre-onboarding principles. And now we will turn the time over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Sam. So my name is Erica Newell, and I am elated to be here. Thank you guys all for tuning in today. This is definitely a topic that I'm passionate about, and we'll talk about some stats and statistics that talk about how key onboarding is. But first, I wanted to start out with a little bit of a story. So by means of introduction first, I worked in coaching and leadership development at Wells Fargo for years and years and years before moving into client success officially at a tech company and in marketing. And I really have loved the transition. And with that being said, there was so much that I learned about onboarding and the relevance. And so today I'm going to talk about 3 keys that I found that are game changers when it comes to keeping the relationship for a longer period of time. So Sam, you can advance to the next slide here. So one story that makes me think a lot about onboarding and what we do in client success is one time, my family and we went to this new restaurant. It opened in our town, and we were so excited to go. And so we went. I was a kid. I'm an older sibling, and my little brother and I were sitting at kind of our own little corner. And as we walked into this restaurant, sat down, I noticed that we were with a large group, so we had 2 servers. One was obviously more experienced, kind of giving directions to the other server, and the other one looked nervous, kind of pacing and looking at our group like he didn't really know what to do. So the more tenured or the more veterans server, I could hear him just giving advice, and over and over and over again, he just kept saying, hey, if you just remember one thing, just keep the glasses of water full. And so we sat down, we ordered our food and everything, and my little brother ordered a Sprite or a soda. And it was really funny because throughout the dinner, we started, eating and talking and all of that. And my brother was sipping down his Sprite, his soda, until he was about halfway. And me and this new server made eye contact across the table. And the server in their mind was like, I'm running over. I'm going to sprint over to fill up that water. Grasping that pitcher, runs across the restaurant and tops my brother's Sprite off with water. And so I start laughing, and my brother starts kind of laughing too. And we just decide to keep it going. So my brother keeps drinking his watered down Sprite. As it gets about halfway down, again, the other server, the more experienced one, remembers he has Sprite and comes and refills his glass with Sprite. And so throughout the dinner, his glass kept being filled with Sprite and water and mixing those 2. And so this is a principle in client success that I think about a ton, is how often do we actually do this as well? Do we do the same thing? The glass of water stayed full, but it wasn't supposed to be water, or it was only half water, half of what he wanted or what the server wanted to give him. And so how often in client success are we doing the same thing? And how often do we fill our customers' cups with what they maybe didn't order? So let's move to the next slide here. So today I'm going to be talking about my 3 keys to effective onboarding and making sure that we're filling the glass with the right beverage, but still keeping it full, right? So the first one would be understanding your customer's definition of success, communicating expectations and status, and then acting with strategy and intention, working with a plan. So we'll talk through all 3 of those today. Let's go to the next slide here. So we often focus on our own goals. So we're going to start with some of the numbers and why this matters. So in a survey done, $1.18 billion is the median cost for a SaaS company to acquire $1 of new customer revenue. That number, when I heard that, really, really surprised me. That is a huge, huge number. Let's move to the next slide. This stat blew me away as well. I think if you've worked in client success or in a client-facing role, you understand how key relationships are. But this statistic really drew that out for me. So it is 4 times cheaper to upsell existing customers than acquire new ones. and 9 times cheaper to retain existing customers than acquire new customers. So looking at those numbers, this really, really matters. Let's go to the next slide as well. So last stat here. So 40 to 60% of clients who signed up for free software in 2015 never used it again. So looking at how much that costs, adoption is paramount, and making sure that your relationship starts out on the right front is key. So really retaining customers and saving that revenue starts with adoption, and that starts with onboarding. And in order to do that, we have to understand our client's perspective. Let's go to the next slide here. So one key principle to remember, hang on your wall, keep in mind in every interaction is your clients don't actually care about your products and services. What your clients actually care about is the result, or what challenge are you helping them alleviate. And so understanding this helps change your perspective a little bit on what you're doing. Of course, we have company goals and things that we want to achieve. But really, what it comes down to is, are we helping our customers be successful? And in order to do that, let's go to the next slide. We have to, of course, define success and understand what that looks like for our clients. We can move to the next slide as well. So Lincoln Murphy, one of my favorite people that I follow in the customer success field, said this quote: so proper onboarding is not done to prevent churn. It's done to ensure the customer achieves their desired outcome. Retention comes from that. So again, we really have to figure out what is the goal here for our clients, and keeping our business goals in mind is of course key, but really what we need to focus on is how do we help communicate and from the beginning ensure that we're hitting and driving towards our clients' goals. Let's go to the next slide to see where this starts and what this looks like. So one key principle that I've learned and I've had personally a ton of success with is to start early in asking these questions. So one way that you can do this is in keeping a strong relationship with your sales counterpart. And I personally like to keep such a close relationship with sales that I know what's coming, so I can get involved early in conversations so that I have a pulse on not only what clients are signing or could be signing, but what are they interested in. When a client does sign, before I even talk to the client or when they're close to signing, I'll hold a meeting with sales to discuss the sales process. Tell me more about some of your challenges. Who were our key advocates internally? What were the key benefits that this customer saw or got elated about, or product features? And that really helps at least give me a baseline or something that I can build off of. It also communicates to the client when I first get on the phone with them that I have background, that when they come to me, I've done research and I understand. Now, one key thing to keep in mind as well is sometimes we as organizations put our customers into buckets. So we define what is the value proposition that our company or our product or our service gives to clients. And sometimes we assign to customers, we think, yes, this is the value proposition that they gravitated towards. But it could not be that actual, marketing slogan or something that you promote internally is the benefit that your customer is actually interested in. So of course it's important to meet with sales to understand what that looks like or what they perceive that is from the customer. But from there, you definitely want to talk to the customer. Let's go to the next slide here. So this is a really important part, is asking your client how they define success. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but doing this right from the get-go is something that can help navigate and steer your conversations. It also helps you set expectations up front. This is something that Sam talked about that I really, really liked, in that setting expectations, and we'll talk a little bit more about communication strategy in a second. But that is paramount because you are training your customers on how that relationship is going to go in the future. So I also do a Google survey with many of my clients. You can use a lot of other survey platforms, or I do this on calls with them as well. It just kind of depends on what level of touch my client is. And I like to understand, Sam talked about understanding the key individuals, of course, that are at the organization, but I also want to understand their industry a little bit better. I want to understand their business and their users, because once I really understand their pain point, that's when I can help alleviate those with my product service, or really dive into what I can do to help. In addition to that, understanding the terms, just expectations of the contract, and navigating that all up front has really helped build a solid foundation for a lot of clients. And then one of the things that I think sometimes we forget about or we place less importance on is in the documentation. And documenting is, I would say, almost as important as having these conversations, because if you don't document, you may not remember key, selling points for these clients. You also may, when something changes, maybe their goal in 6 months changes, and we've showed them some value. We've helped them alleviate this concern. If you can redefine that and you have a documentation of that growth with a client, it helps you show them value over time, which is really valuable. So in terms of documentation, there's a few places that I typically will document. So of course, I talked about the survey a little bit. We also have a CRM. So we also use ClientSuccess, but making sure that that's in a central place that also other team members can access and understand and dig into a client. Every once in a while, we'll organize our business as well a little bit differently. So we may realign some accounts or change some things that way. This has been one of the biggest helps whenever we've done that, because then if a new client success manager is taking on the relationship, they can communicate seamlessly that they understand the history, the goals, the objectives, and then they can grow from there. So they're not completely starting over. Looks like we have
one question I have for you, Erica.
Yeah.
What happens when maybe there's an internal conflict where the definition of success is different from different points of view? One person may be getting it set up, another person's like, no, I need this to drive X. What do you do when you notice internal conflict?
And are you talking internally within the client's organization or internally within your own business?
I think within the client, there's what do you do to resolve any differences on how each of the customers define success?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think it's also important to document all of those. So Sam mentioned understanding different relationship types, and I would echo this in that you may have someone who signs a contract who it's really important, of course, to get their buy-in because they may be the final approval on retaining your business. However, there may be a key user that will use you day to day. And so it's trying to find that balance, right? And so understanding in your conversations with clients and also internally, all of that, and kind of simplifying that into one goal and establishing that together. So one way that I've done this, so I document, of course, all of the key value propositions that different users will bring up or things that they're really excited about. And then what I like to do is in meetings like executive business reviews, I will touch on all those points. And depending on who's in attendance, sometimes I'll emphasize things more in an executive level. And sometimes I'll customize that to be a little more user-centric if there's a larger base of users. And then what I actually like to do in client success, I think really the challenge is in being a leader and a partner where you don't necessarily work for their organization, but the goal is to become such a valued, trusted partner that it feels like you do. And so sometimes I actually have conversations with teams where we kind of steer, and if there's maybe conflict in different parts of the business want to do different things, we actually sometimes all help facilitate those conversations and build those business strategies with the organizations that I work with. So if you can become that trusted partner and foster a place where they're open to communicate, you document different users and what their different goals are, I think it becomes a lot easier to navigate. Great question.
That's great. Maybe quick, have you developed a template for the value propositions for stakeholders?
Yeah,
I think would like to build one for a sales team.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that maybe we can post or send out kind of after. But definitely, I think, well, we can develop our own value propositions and we can kind of put people into buckets of the things that they are finding value in. Again, it's really important to understand that in a client's language and how do they perceive that. And so while it's definitely something that I have and I document and everything, I also really try and document the words that clients use and understanding in how they define that.
Yep, that's a great point. Inside out thinking, or actually outside in thinking with your customer.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's move to the next slide. So we talked about defining success. Now let's talk about what that communication looks like. So in terms of communication in onboarding, setting expectations is paramount. Now, if you think about it, in every relationship, we all have heard about how key first impressions are. Onboarding is the ultimate first impression. A lot of the time you do this over the phone, so it's setting the stage for how our meetings are going to work, what our communication plan will look like, what our relationship will look like, etc. And so the beginning and onboarding is so important. I can't emphasize it enough because it's the number one indicator, and it's the biggest way that you can train your clients to be kind of challenging or easy to deal with, right? And that really comes from that onboarding and how to communicate. So for implementation, there's a few different things that you want to make sure that you're setting expectations about. Like I mentioned in some of the last slides, is I think one of the key things is talking over the contract piece, depending on your business model and what that looks like, but making sure everybody's on the same page in terms of what they're getting out of the contract and kind of the black and white, what they signed up for. Just addressing this on calls has been game changer for me in implementation, because sometimes I'll find that in the sales process, maybe when it went to a legal team or something like that, they negotiated something that the users didn't know about. So making sure that everybody's on the same page that way makes things a lot easier down the road. And sometimes it's just a really simple, quick thing that we review. Also helping clients understand the team and support. Who do they have available and who do they go to? And feel confident that they have people working for them and support available if they need it. Then definitely digging into what does implementation look like and defining for clients that implementation process and different checkpoints. I'll show you a quick sample of one in a few minutes, but really for your organization, you'll need to do this individually. And what stages are there in implementation, and have different checkpoints so you can start with early wins along the way. The earlier that you can kind of define, hey, we've moved past this stage, we're on to the next one, the more progress a client will feel. Defining timelines is also really key so that they know in implementation how long this will take. If I don't deliver something, what's going to be the impact on our rollout date, etc. And then also making sure that they understand what the communication structure will look like. So how often will you be speaking during implementation? If there are a lot of tickets or technical things that they need support with, what will that communication look like? And if you're communicating with strategy and helping them at a higher level with their organization, who will be involved in each of those meetings, etc., is really key. And then after implementation or near the end of implementation, you still want to set expectations. And I think along the way, during relationships, you constantly need to redefine and make sure that they understand what communication will look like. So after implementation, that may change. Maybe your touch points will be more frequent at first and then drop off, or maybe it will gradually decrease. So making sure that they understand, again, the team and support, where they're at, and cadence and summary of communication after implementation is going to be key. So we'll go to the next slide here. Just real quick, so this is a sample of a basic implementation path. We have a really technical product, so we have different points throughout this, but defining your own implementation stages is really helpful to help create the feeling of progression throughout implementation and onboarding. And then we can go to the next one. So we give a few different pieces of documentation for clients. Just high-level overview, we give sample timelines for calls and deliverables, etc. And right after our first call with the client, we'll send out calendar invitations that will outline not only the deliverable due dates, but these different calls. This has also really been a game changer for me because I also document this on the side. So if a client cancels some calls, I keep track of that. And so if there are delays in implementation because a client is canceling calls or maybe isn't sending through some deliverables, when appropriate and on calls, we'll kind of talk about, hey, we need this file from you, and this could prevent us from launching by this date that was your target. So that really helps them kind of hold them accountable in a way from a partnership standpoint, where again, I reinforce, hey, I know that this is your goal. Maybe your goal was to be live by this date. I want to keep you on track, but there are certain things that we need from you. So this has been really helpful as well. And we can move to the next one as well. So we also, with our implementation process, we set a certain timeline, but we give the option to, if they want to accelerate it and move faster through it, we have a workbook that we send out. And I think the biggest value in this is they understand what's coming. They can move at their own pace if they'd like to, but otherwise we'll help keep them on track with the schedule that we have. So having these types of materials has really, really been influential for my customers, helping them feel more secure in our relationship and how often we're communicating, what those will look like. And it also helps them kind of see what our relationship's going to evolve to down the line. We can go to the next slide. I guess before that, any questions around communication? Let's see, we have some Q&As here.
One question, how are you gauging your checkpoints along the way with your communication, or even what you're trying to do with work? How do you set the priority of those accounts?
Ooh, good question. I feel like I've done a lot of evolving when it comes to this. So I really love that someone asked this. So a lot of the time, so for me, it's defining a tier of client, and then within that, understanding that, like Sam called it pulse, or kind of what their happiness level is, or maybe not even just happiness, but what is their loyalty level, which is kind of even deeper, are really important in balancing those things. So the first thing that I do is tier the client accounts, and you can tier that. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can do this, but you can do it by, of course, annual recurring revenue. You can tier it by type of account or brand recognition, and come up with a scale that way. And once you've built those tiers, and then you cross that with where are they at in implementation and how much support do they need, and from there, it really helps prioritize those. What I like to do is block out time for every client every week. And so that way I can make sure that I'm devoting specific amounts of time to especially those key clients, maybe the ones that are really high brand recognition, ones that you would hear every day, and making sure that I'm giving them a little more attention. Good question. So now let's
All right.
dig into the final key that I have is acting with strategy and intention. And when I talk about strategy and intention, there's a lot of different things that you can do here. But I would say the biggest kind of overall umbrella point here is making sure that your interactions are giving value every time. So every time you're talking to a client, making sure that they're walking away with something new or they understand that they have a win is pretty key. So in the training stage, we'll talk about using the data a little bit more, but making sure that your training programs are retainable and actionable. So some different things that I've learned, and there are a ton of studies and research around this, is if you have a very complex product, it's best to do training in smaller, more digestible increments. So maybe smaller trainings versus a big, long training. And of course, if you're doing it virtually versus in person, that can change how you may do your training as well. Also, making sure that you're celebrating implementation. So having a launch call to define, hey, this is where our relationship changes into this next stage in your client journey. So we're going to, instead of talking twice a week, we're going to talk every other week for the next few weeks. Something like that. So resetting expectations and also celebrating the work that they've done to get rolled out. And then after launch is, of course, understanding engaging adoption and then establishing early wins. So making sure that they understand when they are seeing a win in your product or with your service. Let's go to the next slide there. So in terms of adoption, I like to think like a marketer. So you use the data. So there's a bunch of things that I do to understand. Of course, I talk to my clients really regularly to understand how they're feeling about the product, what their adoption looks like. But I don't just leave it there. I use different tools to dig in to understand how often are they actually using our product and are they using best practices? What does that look like? Are they using different functions that will help and connect to the goal that they established early on? And so using data to kind of back up and plan for your calls is really valuable and helps you maybe identify some gaps in things that maybe they didn't understand in training or they could use a refresher on. Also, making sure that we are asking for client feedback is pretty key. But one thing to keep in mind as well is that asking for client feedback and then doing nothing about it actually creates a more negative experience for a client than if you had not asked for feedback at all. So if you are going to ask for feedback about the implementation process or the product or their rollout, make sure that you can give steps or updates with how you're looking to improve in those areas. And we can advance to the next slide. So finally, just to recap, so my 3 keys of effective onboarding are understanding your customer's definition of success, communicating expectations and status frequently, and then finally, acting with strategy and intention, working with a plan. And I'll turn it over to McKayl.
All right. McKayl, are you there? Are you still available?
Sorry about that. I muted myself too long. So thanks for joining today. Great points, Erica and Sam. I especially love how you mentioned that it's important to find critical information early and to develop a plan and give people that plan so they can start to fill in what needs to happen instead of feeling like they need to do it all on their own. I'll keep it quick and short here since we have just a couple minutes. The key thing on how do you approach adoption, go to the next slide, is you need to keep in mind that the new workflow in your platform needs to be easier than their old workflow. And that sounds like a simple concept and a little bit silly, but you need to remember that they have a context, their business has its own way of working. They have their own concerns, they have their own process, different people that they work with, even the vocabulary and kind of concerns that will influence the way that they use your product. So you need to understand them, next slide, really well. To get adoption, you need to understand them so you know what they're looking for, and you need to help them not just use the platform, but get value out of the platform, which means delivering upon what they wanted to help them solve. They don't, like Erica said and Sam said, they don't really care what they have to click on. They don't really care about your platform specifically. They want to get something out of it. And if they do, they'll buy more. And that's, for us, that's the purpose of adoption. Next slide. So in short, quit thinking like a CSM and start thinking like a user. When you are focusing internally on your KPIs or your goals or your objectives for a quarter or a week or a month, that's not the things that your customers care about. You need to start thinking like them. So when you sit down to plan out how you get adoption, you need to ask yourselves, what did my client do yesterday? Like literally, what did they do? What does their workflow look like? What are the things that they cared about yesterday? What are things that were frustrating? Where did my platform fit into this? Is it something they used once? Did they not use it? Or was it really essential to their job? Start thinking like that. And essentially you need to answer those questions. And to answer them, the best way is to talk to your users. So next slide. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so you need to talk to your users to understand them. And as you talk to them, you'll find that obstacles to adoption tend to fall essentially into one of these buckets. There's lots of different individual ones, but they boil down to these. Your users are either going to be afraid of learning your system because they feel like they don't have time, or they're not comfortable learning something new, or perhaps there's kind of a technology fluency curve where they're a little bit on the slower side. Or alternatively, as you talk to them, you may find that they've tried, they've given it their best, but your product isn't delivering quite the experience that they are hoping for. Go to the next slide. All right, so if it's the first one, and they say, I'm afraid of learning a new way, I'm not sure how to do this, I don't really want to spend time learning your system, then they're probably thinking that either they lack time, they're embarrassed by not knowing, or they just don't know how to start. And keep in mind from this nice little graphic in the center, like I said, they have a ton of things on their mind. Those are all competing with your time and with your platform. If those things take priority over platform, then they won't take time to learn this new product. Go to the next slide. All right. Now, the second universal obstacle is your product doesn't do what we want it to do. If I was in a meeting room with people, I would ask people to raise their hand if they had ever heard this, and basically every hand goes up. This tends to fall into three buckets here, and they're color-coded by what's important and what's not quite as important. The first one is they say, you know, this product's not meeting my expectations, and you talk it through with them, and they explain what they want it to do or what they're looking for, the job that they need to get done that they can't yet, and they explain, no, I kind of realized after I sold that I needed to get this thing done, and that's not really what your product does. And this can go two ways after that. At that point, they can either realize, oh, you know what, this might limit how I use your product a bit, but it's still valuable. And so this becomes kind of that smoke signal or that flag that the sales team or your team can say, hey, you know, product managers, this might be something we should explore a year out from now. Alternatively, sometimes they say, you know what, I forgot about this thing I need to get done, but it is really, really important for me. And when that's the case, you end up in these red buckets, primarily the bottom one, where they say, this just doesn't deliver what we need. And so that's a point where you need to kind of talk with your product team to see if it's possible to tweak the platform to get what they need. And similarly, you also need to talk with your sales team or any other previous steps in this onboarding process to make sure that expectations were aligned. And they may have been or they may have not been. There's always room for improvement, but you want to kind of close that loop and make sure that next time for the next customer, we're more on track. Let me touch on the second point here. Nearly done. The second one in the middle, this kind of lighter red, is where they say, your product doesn't do what we want it to do. And the case here is that the end result is appropriate. For Lucid Press, one of those things might be posting to Facebook. The end result is appropriate. But then they say, well, like the way I got there, I didn't really like. It was kind of confusing, or it was clunky, or I didn't understand what I needed to do, or I couldn't find where I do this. Those are opportunities, next slide, for you to work with your product management team, but there are also opportunities for you to sell the value of changing to your new user. Something you need to keep in mind when you hit that point is they're comparing your platform and your workflows to their previous product or to their previous process. So if you can understand that process and speak to them and say, you know what, it is different. It is a little different, but you can learn this, I promise. Here's a one-page PDF that shows you how to do it. Or why don't we set up a training call in a couple weeks so we can train more people on how to do this. There's various ways you can address that and teach people to do something that they need to do in order to change over time. But when this happens, you have to sell the value of change with the new user. Next slide. All right, you can skip past this one. Okay. Now, this second one here, or this one here, this is a solution. Like I mentioned, you need to understand your users. When this happens and they say the end result's appropriate, but your product doesn't really do what I want because it didn't work the way I wanted it to, you need to interview your users and you need to start asking them questions like, what did you do before? Can you outline those steps for me? Maybe make a flow chart together. Or say, you know, help me understand how this process fits with the process of these other people we've been talking to. I don't understand that. But approach this humbly and start asking questions to really internalize their context so you can work with them. Just go to the next slide. All right. The follow-up to that is, like I mentioned for that second point and that third point, remember the red boxes, is there may be an opportunity here for your product team to step in. I know this is tricky. Everybody could probably say, you know what, it's hard to work with my product team. They've got a million things to do. And that's totally true. But when you hit these points where the client says, you know, this doesn't work how I wanted it to, then you need to work with your product management team to convey why this needs to be changed. And sometimes you need to convey that it needs to be changed, and they don't quite know why was this process not good. So learn to make an effective business case. You could have a whole 2 hours on this. Learn to make an effective business case by basically noting how much money is at risk or how much money there is to be gained. If there are any important logos that kind of have star power, so to say, or influence in your target industry, as well as a very clear description of what the steps were presently, what the client wanted them to be, and then why one of those things was not good. You need to help explain why. When you can compile all of that together and present evidence to your product team, they're much more likely to be able to say, you know what, I can devote a bit of time with my engineers to fix this with you. And from there, you need to be working with the product team and, like I said, user interviews to make sure that what is a proposed solution is going to work for the client. All right, so I know we're a little bit over time. I can stop here. If you go to the next slide, that basically wraps it up. The key thing to adoption is to understand people first. Always people first. You can click, you can train, you can send PDFs as much as you want. But if you don't understand their context, their vocabulary, their concerns, and what they're excited about, then it's going to kind of fall flat. So understand the people first, talk to them, and then pitch the process and train them second.
All right. Well, there's some information if you would like to connect with McKayl Bergman there on her LinkedIn. Everyone else is also on LinkedIn, Sam and Erica. We appreciate all the attendees that have shown up today, and all the questions have been phenomenal. We have a few action items we'll send you. We'll send you the recording. We'll send out Sam's blog. with some of those things that go in detail about what he discussed about lifecycle. We'll talk, a few of you asked for some lifecycle example templates. We'll do that also in the email. We want to thank all of those customer success professionals out in the world that attended today, and appreciate for all you do to drive this forward. We want to thank Sam and Erica and McKayl for their work and contribution to this community as it continues to grow and has positive impacts to brands and companies all over the world. We're excited to look for the next email of our next webinar that will be coming up in July. It's an awesome topic